The book of James, and I'm not giving you a specific passage because this morning we're doing a little bit of a recap because we came to the last verses of the book of James last week. And just to kind of get us up to speed, really, I guess where we ended off last week as we're circling back for the recap, when we made it to the last two verses of the book of James last week, and I'll just read them as I recap because it's only two verses. James 5, 19 and 20. This is where we ended last week, only two verses. It says, "Brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins." Last week we talked about this reality that, God, again, this book is being written to the church, the early church, the first, the foundations of the church, the first churches were gathering. This was the first book that was written in the New Testament. And in the midst of the church, there was this reality that you can wander away from these things. You can listen to the truth. You can hear everything that's said. You can like it. Oh, those are some nice words. I appreciate that. But then you can wander away from it. And usually the way that the word that James used there, when he put in the word wander, it wasn't it could happen, but it wasn't a sudden diversion to another path. It wasn't like, oh, I'm doing really, really good, and bam, I'm on a new path. It was things start creeping in. Compromises start being made. It's a gradual thing. Like I'm listening to things I shouldn't be listening to. And all of these things start culminating into this thing where it's like, I'm going down the path and slowly my trajectory is getting a little bit different. And eventually I'm on a new road that I have no business being on. It's a slow, gradual wandering away from the truth. Again, we just slowly start letting things in and it takes us to where we're not supposed to be. But again, this morning we're going to just recap kind of this entirety of this book because James was super practical Christian living. It is, day in, day out, just living it out. And it's very practical. It was written to the church that was just getting started so that they understood how to live right. There wasn't really much basis for it. They knew the Old Testament. They had all the laws and such. But then Jesus, he changed some things. He didn't do away with the law, but he kind of just showed them this is how it really looks to live this out, and to live this out in your community, and to live this out in your family, and to live this out with others, to live this out in the church now, because the church was new at this point, and all of these things. But when we think about the entirety of the book of James, when we think back over everything that James has been teaching us in this book, to me there's always really one statement that really stands out heavily in the book of James. If you remember back through the book, that statement is, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. I want you to go with me to James chapter 2, because we're going to look at this passage as we kind of set the foundation for this. James 2. Again, I'll give you just a moment to turn over whatever page to get to James chapter 2. We're going to be reading verses 14 through 26. James 2, 14 through 26. And this is like the foundational point of the book of James. Starting in verse 14, James 2. It says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you don't give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' It says, 'You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Do you not see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? in the scripture which was fulfilled, which said, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. He was called a friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Again, we see this huge point in the book. Huge point in Christian living, period, but a huge point in the book of James. There's so much practicality in the book of James, but James is like, this practicality has to become something. It has to become just more than just this letter that I'm writing it. This has to be real in our lives. It has to be worked out. He's making this point, and we clarified this when we were there. Even when he says, that you're not justified just by faith, you're justified by works also. He's not saying that works save you. He's saying that works evidence that the faith is real, and when they're hand in hand and when they're together, then the whole package is there. Because the whole package is faith that works. Faith that's just talk, that doesn't become anything, as James is making the point here, might not be real faith at all, because real faith gets to work. And so if one to be justified has that real faith that begins to be acted out in their lives. It ain't just talk anymore. Real faith that gets to work is the faith that justifies somebody. So works don't make faith real. They just show that it is real. They show that it is real. He gives these examples in this passage. He talks about Abraham. He talks about Rahab. You think about these situations, like, how would my faith get put to work in this situation? Abraham and Sarah's story, how, years and years and years, they were childless. They didn't have any children long into old age, likely into their 90s, how the biblical story is written. They didn't have children at that point, but God had promised them a child. God said that you're going to have children and your descendants are going to, number the sand on the seashore, however it was said. And they're in their 90s, like, this hasn't happened. They do some things that they weren't supposed to do to try to, build that bridge, so to speak. But God's like, I still got this. And you just haven't believed that I got this. And so God gave them this son. He gave them Isaac. He blessed them in this way. But then God challenged the faith of Abraham. And again, it's like when we think about how would we respond in something. After all of these years, God gave them this child, Isaac. And then God says, now I want you to give him back to me. I want you to sacrifice the life of your child to me. And we look at that and we're like, man, that sounds crazy. Like, why would God ever ask somebody to do that? But God had a plan all along. God knew exactly about his business. Obviously, he's God. But he has him go through these steps. He tells Abraham and his son, he's like, go to this other land, go towards this, he's like, head out into this general area. Doesn't even tell him where he's going. When he gets out in that general area, he's like, okay, go to this mountain. Take your son with you. And even when Abraham's talking to his son, he literally has his son grab the wood and carry it up the hill, like the wood that he's planning to be sacrificed on, like be burnt on as a burnt offering to God. The son is carrying the wood up the hill. And when you look at, how this is laid out, Isaac likely wasn't a little child at this point. He was likely a grown man, probably in his late teens, early 20s, something like that. So he had to willfully kind of go along with his father in this. He's kind of like, Dad, like, what's up? What are we doing? Abraham's like, you'll see when we get there. His faith is like overwhelming, and he's like, I can't imagine what he's going through as his son is carrying this wood and he's walking up this mountain, and they're getting to this place. And Abraham had so much faith in this God. He's like, even if he asked me to do something that I can't even comprehend, I'm going to follow him. I'm going to listen to him because I trust that his way is better than my way. I trust that he's going to work this out. I trust that he's going to make something better out of this. He's already promised that my descendants are going to do this. So he's got a plan to make this happen. And when you went into the book of Hebrews and they give the account of the story, it says in Hebrews that Abraham's faith was so great that he knew that even if he had to take the life of his child at that point, that God would rise him back up. That's what Hebrews says. There was so much faith in this man. But he gets to this point and he gets up this hill and he raises the knife over his head to like take the life of his son. And God's like, stop. You've proven your point. Your faith is real. He's like, there's an animal right there caught in the bushes. That's the sacrifice that you have today. there's a lesson for you to be learned here, you and your son. You guys are never going to forget this one. You're never going to forget this. And faith was built. I mean, for one, faith was tested, faith was proven, but faith was even built on this day. And those two, again, an older father and likely a young man at this point, probably sat down and recounted exactly what the events were of that day. And wow, like that's what was going on. But God tested the faith. Like it was proven for Abraham. It wasn't just talk for Abraham. Abraham had so much trust in God that even if I don't understand what is going on, I'm going to listen to him anyways, because I trust that his plan, purposes, and understanding of the situation is so much greater than mine. And even they use the story of Rahab, and Rahab wasn't even an Israelite. She wouldn't have even been welcomed in these circles. And yet, God used her when the Israelites were going to Jericho to try to take the city, and God had sent them there, that found this non-Israeli woman who's like, I'm here to help. Like, I know who your God is. I'm going to help out in this situation. She was a prostitute. She wasn't an Israelite. She was all of these things. And God's like, I'm going to use you. And again, sometimes we struggle in our faith. It's like, how would God use me with my problems and with my brokenness and with all these things? Like, God used her when she wasn't even like welcomed into the promised people of that way. God had a plan all throughout the Old Testament that his home, his kingdom was open for everybody. But at that point, that wasn't really public knowledge to everybody. And God still pulled this lady out, even with the problems, even with the mess, and used her. Showed her faith. She risked her life, because if they would have found out what she was doing, she would have been killed by her own people. And yet her faith was so great that I'm still going to act on what God is doing, rather than in my comfort, rather than in my self-preservation, rather than in all of these things. I'm still going to listen to him first. And so we see these moments where faith is demonstrated through works. Faith is demonstrated through works that had world impact, impacted the world. And these are really dramatic situations. Like, I don't know, maybe there's different situations in our life where faith has been put to the test. It's probably put to the test every day. Sometimes it's in small measures. Sometimes it's in the hardest of situations where, faith is really getting tested right now. Am I really going to end up at his feet right now, calling out to him? Or am I just going to go into a whirlwind of a mess and try and deal with this on my own? Like, do I really trust him to carry me through? Is my faith there that I really trust everything that he's promised to me? Because when we talked about even the wandering away last week, a lot of times I think the wandering away in this life is because we don't really have the faith to see that everything he's promised to me is incredible. So I'm going to go and try and get everything I can right now. I'm going to try and fill my life with everything I can right now, because I don't really believe in all of the good that he has promised me. So I got to get everything I can. Again, there's these tests of our faith that are happening, but James says in this, he says, faith without works is dead. There's this test, like we say, and I hope you say you have this faith. If you don't have a relationship with Jesus, we start there. We start there. He died, he was buried, he rose again to save a sinner like me. The lady Rahab, a murderer like Paul, a denier of Christ like Peter, all of these people, he died to save us. And I sit here and I say, I believe in him. But again, the old saying says, the actions speak louder than words. Is our faith just words, or does our faith get to work? Again, James even says in this chapter 2, when he's talking about having this faith and showing it and seeing how it works, he makes this statement. He's like, you believe that there is one God. This is verse 19 of James 2. He says, you believe that there is one God. Basically, that's great. You believe there's one God. You do well. It's like even the demons believe that. Even they believe that. They know he's real. They have no doubt that he is real and he can put them in their place. They know that. So if where we're at is only oh yeah, I believe there's a God, man, we're at the same comprehension level as the demons right now. They probably have greater comprehension than that. James is like, that's great. That's wonderful. That's a starting point. Now you say you believe in him, what you going to do about it? So I think that's what he's building up. It's like it can't just stop there. So we look through this book and we see these things, and it's about starting to live God's way. I mean, the demons believe, but they don't start living God's way. We believe we need to start living his way. So what does that look like? And so when we think about, again, the recap of the whole book of James, you think about the practical works that James taught us. Like, what has he been teaching us through this book? And there's so many, obviously. There was a lot of different things. We've been in this book since, I think, January 1st or right around then. So we've been in here for a minute. There's been a lot of things going on here. There's a lot of practical works that James taught us. But, I mean, even just some of the highlights of this, I think of, in chapter 3, I'm not going to read through all these, but in chapter 3, a lot of chapter 3 was talking about our tongue. Talking about the words that come out of our mouth, the things that we say, whether they bless people or whether they curse people, whether it's good or bad, whether, our talk is a problem or our talk is God glorifying. It's like, it says our tongue has a lot of power, it has a lot of weight. He referred to our tongue as, the analogy that he gave was to like the rudder of a ship. And I remember that week when we went over this, and I don't remember what the numbers were at this point, but I pulled up the numbers, even modern day boats, and you think of like cruise ships and oil tankers and cargo ships, and they're huge. I mean, these things are thousands of feet long, and yet the rudder's like 10 feet long. I mean, the size at which this small rudder can be utilized to turn this enormous vessel. James is saying, you need to think about that, like the gravity of that. This little thing is moving that whole ship. It can drive it into the rocks. It can drive it to where it needs to go. It can get a job done, or it can drive in circles. It can do all of these things. He said, that's your tongue. You got this little thing in your mouth, this little muscle, such a small percentage of your body mass, and yet you can cause a whole lot of problems with it, or you can do a whole lot of good with it. Like, you can bless God with it, or you can tear down the people around you with it. That's pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. That's a very dramatic sides of something that can do both of those things. James talks about controlling our tongue. That was one of the things, controlling our tongue. James talked about helping people in need. In chapter 1, in verse 27, he makes a statement. James says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. One of James's factors in just real Christian living is having a heart for others. I mean, there's a reason why when Jesus said, the greatest commandments, he's like, if you think of the entire Old Testament commandments, Jesus boiled it down to 2 sentences. He said, love your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. He says, if you can take care of those 2 things, you got it in the bag. You can take care of all of these things if you legitimately do these 2 things. Not just in, that's a good idea, not in some vague way. He says, love your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Really to care for their needs above yourself, really. The people around you. So part of this living, again, our tongue. A focus on others, a caring for others. And even when we take in this idea of our outlook on others, there was also several passages in the book of James that talk about really not treating people wrong and not treating people with favoritism and preference. At the beginning, again, of James 2, there's these verses right after that verse 27 in James 1. So right in the beginning of chapter 2, it says, my brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For that there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should come also a poor man with filthy clothes. And you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and you say to him, hey, come sit here in this good place. And you say to the poor man, you stand there, you sit there at my footstool. Have you not shown partiality amongst yourselves, and have you become judges with evil thoughts? Again, this is coming right after James says you need to have this other focused mentality that starts with the widows and the orphans and the least of these and the kind of the the ones that definitively need that help. We start there and we expand from there. We have this others focused heart and love and care. And then Jen says, and check yourselves in the church. When we think about how we deal with others, how we engage with others, and how we love others, how we welcome people into the church. He's like, if some rich man walks in, you don't just start laying out the red carpet for him because he's got money. Maybe he can bring more money into the church. Maybe he could do this or that. Maybe he can help me. No. He's like, this is God's house. Nobody, not a single one of us has any greater standing before God. There's God and there's people. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a world leader. I don't care if you're one of the wealthiest men on earth. I don't care how educated you are. I don't care how bad you've been. I don't care how poor you are. I don't care how many times you messed up. I don't care where you're at right now this morning. There's a level playing field of God, people. When people come in, we treat people right, but we treat people the same. If there's problems, we can deal with problems when problems come. But we don't show preference. We don't show favoritism. We especially don't start from a place of materialism wow, what can we get from this person? James warned about that. Paul, when he was writing to Timothy, says that leaders were going to do that. He said there's going to be a lot of people that claim the name of Jesus, that claim the things of God, who have this, kind of this facade of godliness, but they're trying to get their pockets lined. They're trying to get theirs. They're trying to make money. They're trying to get wealthy off of people. And he said they're going to use God's name to do it. James says we don't treat people different because we're welcoming them into God's house. And if the rich man deserves a seat, the poor man deserves it too. It's weird. In our small human minds, we see these differentiations between people and accomplishments and wealth and all these things. None of that's even a drop in the bucket to who God is. And so it's we are so vastly far away from him that we're on the same exact plane for all of us. But again, we control our tongue. We help those in need. We avoid favoritism. We treat people equally. James is presenting these things. We, as a practical work, we go to God in the midst of our problems and in the trials. And in James 1:5, right at the beginning of the book again, James is talking about trials. And I'll read the verses before that. But starting in verse 2, it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." It says in verse 5 now, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to you." But he follows and he says, "But let him ask in faith once again, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind." And he says, "For do not let that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. For he is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways." Again, we're going to go through things. That's the precedent. It's crazy to think that the first book written to the early church, the opening statements are, we're going to go through some things, guys. Count it all joy. And that's not just, we talked about, it's not put on a happy face. It's go to him. We've talked about this before, that joy there is the word joy there in verse 2 of James 1 is the middle name that our daughter carries, and the original language word for that was the word kara. My daughter's still kind of learning to like that. But that word kara, joy, it doesn't mean just happy. It means I found true joy because of the grace of God. I understand who he is. I understand how good he is. And in all of the problems, when the storm is raging, I can still yet rest in this joy because he doesn't change. His goodness never changes. He still got me. And so, I had the news on last night. There's all these crazy just storms going through the whole country right now, and tornadoes hitting everywhere, and all these things that are happening. And I guess a tornado went down my family street out in Texas, and they were without power for a week, and everybody's doing all this stuff, and all these crazy things that are going on. But the picture here is that, again, opening statements to the early church, first book that's written, guys, there's going to be some problems coming. But what he says is, but we've got a storm shelter. It's like the storms are coming. The storm shelter is understanding who he is, his grace, and finding your joy in that. It's like all the storms can be raging. You can be safe in the storm shelter of that joy, because that does never change. And he says, and again, God is so good. He's like, but I know you're not going to get this all. Like, I know you're not going to remember everything. I know you don't got it all together. And he says, and if you lack wisdom in that moment, if you're struggling in that moment, if you don't know what the response is right now, if you don't know what to do right now, God says, come to me. I would love to tell you what this is all about. I would love to help you through this. The reality is that the wisdom that we need is likely already right here in his word, but he'll take us there. He'll get us there. He gives us what we need when we need it. But again, he says, but have that faith. Don't doubt me. If the faith is real, come in that faith and ask me, and I'd be glad to give it to you. But if it's just talk and you're just coming to me to try to, Band-Aid over a situation, he's like, don't really expect much in that, because then it's not for real. It's not for real at that moment. So, again, control the tongue, helping those in need, not having favoritism, treating people equally, seeking wisdom from God in the midst of trials. And then there's just this general idea through this whole entire book of living with integrity and keeping our word. There's so many things in here, talking about pride and the danger of riches and materialism and all of these things. But there's this overwhelming kind of idea through it of just this living with our God before this world with real integrity. In James 5:12, which that was just a couple of weeks ago, I know we're jumping all around in this. It's only a couple of pages worth of book. But James 5:12, he says, above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. God says, really important starting point. Integrity. Say you're going to do something, do it. If you say you're not going to do something, that's what it is. I mean, even greater than our conversations with people, that's also a conversation we have with God. Don't tell God you're going to do something and not follow through with it. I remember when Solomon was reflecting on a very similar idea, he said in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, I need to, as a human, he says, God is in heaven, I'm on earth. I need to let my words be few. Because he was saying that, the words that I speak before my God, I need to make sure I'm serious about them. I need to make sure that they're right. I need to make sure that, even in my conversation with him, I have that level of respect and integrity that I'm going to follow through with what I tell my God. And that should also trickle down to how I interact with other people. Hopefully, we go through our lives and even as we've talked about this as an ambassador of him, as a reflection of him, because that should be our ultimate goal of all of this living. All of this living that we're doing through the book of James is not to just be better people and to have people see us as being better people. The goal of all of this is to live right so God gets more glory. And when we are not people of integrity, when people can't rely on us, when people don't trust us, when we say something and we don't do it, when we say yes to this or no to this and that doesn't carry any weight, when we say we're a Christian, but people see us living this way, when we make these statements and what we do is the opposite, whatever it is, when people know that there's no real integrity to this relationship with God that we claim to have, then we're no longer an effective ambassador of him. We're no longer a strong witness of his transforming power. We're no longer that witness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It says, you know who I once was, but because he died, because he was buried, because he rose again, because he saved me, because he is transforming me, I am no longer who I once was. And you can clearly see the evidence of that. That's where we need to be. That is where we need to be. I hope for you, as I hope for myself, that the people that knew us in times past And the people that see us now, they say that there is change that has occurred, and they're not just a better person. There's a change that has occurred because a great and powerful God has worked in that life to make them now who they are, because they weren't once that person. And it's a testament of him. Again, there's all this living that goes through this book. Do we have the seriousness to live it? Do we have the integrity to see it through? There's so many more things that we can go so much deeper into the specifics. James laid out a lot of just foundations in this book, and the rest of the New Testament writers are going to continue to build on it. They're going to continue to build on it. But again, as we started, faith without works is dead. There's a lot of practical works that James taught us. And just to kind of bring it full circle and reiterate once again, James told us it's about doing, not just hearing. He said that again in the first chapter. I'll read those verses to you too. James 1, 22 through 25. James says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man observing himself, his face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does." James says, don't deceive yourself. Are you really about this? Like, you can like the things, you can even think like, I think I'm doing pretty good. James is like, take a good hard look. Don't deceive yourself. Is this for real? And is it faith coming into action? Is it transformation happening? Is it God glorifying? He says you can't just hear. Hearing is not enough. We need to be doing. Again, that takes you back to faith without works is dead. You can hear, you can believe, that's great, but are we doing it? There's that analogy there, and we talked about this when we were here. There's this analogy, this man in the mirror analogy. And I put this same statement on the screen when we went through this before. It said, just like a mirror reflects back our physical condition, you look in the mirror, you see how messed up or, maybe doing fine today in the mirror when you wake up. But just like the mirror reflects back our physical condition, the Word of God reflects back our spiritual condition. When you read God's Word, you see, oh, I'm slipping. I'm messing up. Like, I don't got this line up. God said I'm supposed to be about this. God says I'm supposed to think this way. God says I'm supposed to do this thing. God says I'm supposed to raise my kids this way. That I'm supposed to interact with my church this way. That I'm supposed to care for others this way. That I'm supposed to worship Him this way. And if we're not there, the Word of God, when we look into it, is like a mirror that reflects back the imperfections that are still there in our walk. Just like when you wake up and you look in the mirror and you try to get yourself straightened up to go to work or come to church, or we go to the Word of God and we see, like, where do we need work? What can we fix? What can we straighten out? But again, James says it's possible to look in the mirror, walk away, forget what you saw, and do nothing about it. But why in the world would we want to do that? Again, if you woke up and you look, I get out of bed, sometimes my hair is like all over the place because I don't got that much hair, and so the little bit I got, you got to position it correctly, and you get up and it's all over the place. And if I was to walk into work that way, and much worse, what if I got called into court that day or something? I'd look like a fool. And it's just so you look in the mirror and you got to get stuff straightened out. You go to the Word, saying don't walk away from the Word, see the problems and don't do nothing about it. We have to do something about it. Again, someone can look at their spiritual reflection in the Word of God, and maybe it's pointed out some flaws. Maybe you see things that need to be corrected, but even after seeing those flaws and those problems, you can just walk away and do nothing about it. Because maybe you've understood the words intellectually. Maybe you felt emotionally moved by the words of Scripture. Maybe you've enjoyed a sermon at some point, and maybe you even felt challenged by it. But when you see that reflection, do you at that point choose? Because you have to choose. It's not just going to happen by accident. Do you at that point choose to change behavior and actions to come into line with what God has said? Do you make that choice? Or do you just walk away and forget about it? I think of a passage. We'll go to this one together. I promise you, we're going to try and wrap this up. Not too distant future, but we're going to recap and everything. Matthew 7. I know we've been here probably several times through the book of James. We were here this whole book not too long ago. But James gives us Jesus in Matthew 7 gives us, really the same picture. Matthew 7, 21 through 29. Verse 21, Jesus talking. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.' Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he had taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." We see this passage. Jesus is reiterating the same thing. He's like, some people just got words. Some people are like, "Lord, Lord," that's nice. Yay, Jesus. I associate with Jesus. I go to church, whatever. And even in this, it's like they do things and even claim to do things in Jesus' name. But again, it's just words. It's just a show. It's just charades. It's all of those things. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to it and their life is over, they're standing before him, he's like, "I don't know you. You may have used my word, but my name, maybe you use my name to try to get something of it. Maybe you use my name to try to get clout with some people. Whatever it was, you use my name, but you don't know me. You don't have a relationship with me." That would be a bad day to be at. That would be horrible. But Jesus says, again, now he's talking about the hearing and the doing of the word, just like James is talking about. He says, "Whoever hears these sayings of mine, whoever listens to my word and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock." Again, Jesus says, you listen to what I'm saying and do it, storm's still coming. Storm's still coming. Rain's coming, wind's coming, flood's coming. Again, it's the way James opened it up too. James says, trouble's coming. It's like, understand that it's not going to be easy. But Jesus says, if you listen to what I say, you do it. All of that's still going to happen. But you know what's going to be different at the end of it? You're still going to be standing. You're going to make it through. It's like, I remember there's a passage in Isaiah when Isaiah is talking about it. He's like talking about how strong God is and carrying his people through. And he says, like the floods, like the flood waters rose up and I wasn't carried away, and the fires were burning and we were not burned. We walked through the fires and weren't burned. Just the power of God to carry you through these situations. Jesus says, if you hear what I say and you actually do it, you're going to be standing at the end of the day. But then what does he say? But if you hear what I said, again, the second person, the foolish man still heard everything. He still hears it all. He says the foolish man hears the sayings of mine. He hears the word, but he chooses not to do them. He still builds his house. He builds it on the sand. The same storms, the same wind, the same floods, all these things came. House falls. Again, maybe we're going through our life and we're like, why do we can't get out of the problems? Like, why is everything still messed up? Why are we just still treading water? It's like, well, Are you living day in and day out the way that he has told us to live? Because if you are, there's a promise that I'll still, not that the storm's not going to be there, but that I'll carry you through. That you'll be there in that storm shelter. You'll be on a solid foundation. You'll be standing on the rock. He's like, build your house here. We'll make it through. But if you don't, if you choose not to listen to him, and you build on your own ideas, you build on your own desires, you build on your wants, your pleasures, your whatever else, you're building on sand. And maybe you're building a life where it's just, I just want to get what I want. I'll acknowledge God, but I'm not going to do what he says. I'm not worried about eternity, all of these things. Jesus, like, you're just building on sand. Same storm's coming, but you're on the sand. And when everything falls apart, Jesus is like, I already told you. Like, don't be so surprised. He says, great is going to be the fall of your house because you're building on the sand. Same thing James has been telling us this whole time. Again, it's not just hearing, it's doing. I'll put one last verse on the screen just because I have it on here. We looked at this verse before too. Think about what this says. Ezekiel 33. It says, so they come to you. This is, God talking to the people of Israel and through Ezekiel when he was the prophet at that time. And it says, so they come to you as people do. The people of Israel come. They come to you as people do. They sit before you as my people. They hear your words. Like, they're hearing the words that he's saying, like the words of God. But they do not do them. For with their mouth they show much love, but with their hearts they pursue their own gain. When they're talking about what's the root of the problem in Israel at that point, he's like, oh, these words of God are great, but when I get out of here, I'm going to get mine. I'm going to get mine. And you wonder why Israel went through all the problems that they went through. Because it's like, God's great, yay. They're getting the tablets up on the mountain, and we're already making a new God. We're forming a golden calf. It's like, he saved us from Egypt, but now we got to walk we're walking down the desert. It's like, oh, why don't you just take us back to Egypt? I mean, it's just like problem after problem, like not trusting him, not doing what he says, all of these things. But sometimes we're just the same way. Sometimes with our mouth, we're like, I love God. I'll show him all the love in the world. But my heart and my action doesn't align with my mouth. And again, now that becomes an integrity problem. It's like a spiritual integrity problem. I challenge you just to consider your walk. Consider, as we went through all the practicality of this book, consider where we're at. Hopefully we're not insincere. Hopefully we're not superficial. Hopefully we're not committed to our own benefit more than we're committed to God. Because who are we in light of who he is? So, I'm going to stop there in terms of the book recap. But I want to use today as just to introduce something, because we say all the time at the end of the service, and again, I want you to know that it's more than just words. At the end of the service, we say, we're here to help, we're here to pray, we're here to talk with you, we're here, if any of you have questions, we always say that. But again, I want you to know from my wife and I that that's for real. And I'm going to put these things on the screen. I've talked about it before. We talked about practical Christian living. And I've talked about there's a lot of practical things that we go through in life. And we've been planning on when are we going to bring this to the table officially. But let's do it at the recap of the book because we're talking about all this practicality. Again, I talked about today, our hope for you and for ourselves and for everybody in this church is to live a life practically following Jesus day in and day out. But there's a lot of things that get in the way of that. I know that a lot of, so many things if we're not God glorifying and wise in our finances, then when we have all of our money problems and we're struggling and it's causing contention in my house or I'm working 9 times longer than I need to be because we're trying to get all this extra stuff. It's like when we're doing all of that, then I guarantee you, God is not getting all that he deserves because it's become about the money, or it's because our lack of wisdom has led us to a place where we are so behind the 8 ball on this that I can't see him anymore because this is blinding out everything that I can see, because we haven't taken care of the things that are practical. Again, I'm not saying I want people to get rich. It's not about, like, God says it's kind of dangerous to be rich, because you get too much, you might not care about him anymore. That'd be a bad place to be. I don't want people to get rich. I want people to be wise with their finances to the point where finances aren't a problem anymore. It's not like, holding residence in your mind all the time, so that you can focus on him. So again, one of the things these are practical things my wife and I are saying, like, as a couple, as an individual, we can meet separately with people, we can meet together with couples, just to go through some of these things. And this isn't just Eileen's going to say some more in a second, but it's not just, just fixing stuff. It's growth too. Say, I just want to grow. Maybe like, I just want to grow in my marriage. Like, say, like, what's our point? Like, what's our purpose? Like, what are we even doing here? How are we working together so that God gets more glory? Or do we have no concept of that? Because if we have no concept of how that happens, then we're not going to get there. If there's no goal, if there's no target, if there's nothing that you're shooting for, you won't hit any bullseyes. You won't hit any targets. You won't make it anywhere. That's just how it works. But again, financial guidance, help with marriage if there's problems, or just growth in marriage if you just want to seek growth. And that can be growth as an individual too. Dealing with sin. Maybe there's something we just have not gone past. Let's talk about it. Let's deal with sin. Let's talk about accountability. How are we going to work those things out? Maybe you just have questions, or you just say, like, there's this concept in Scripture, I just don't understand it, and I just want to sit down and talk about it. The Trinity, like, so nobody's going to fully get that, but, we can definitely talk about it. But it's, we can talk about questions, or just, I want to learn more on something. Maybe I don't really think I have a relationship with Jesus yet, or I'm still struggling with taking that step, or I'm still struggling with what that means. And by all means, let's sit down and talk about it. Maybe you say, we're seeking for the church over the coming years. I mean, for us, we're in it for the rest of our lives, but to grow and to reach more people and to do things together. And maybe you have a desire to say, I want to be part of that. I want to be a part of what that looks like into the future. I want to, again, this isn't about my wife and I. This is about God's glory. So if everybody says, like, we want to get involved, like, let's figuring it out. Let's do it. But again, there's these just opportunities that we're definitively saying that some people, I think, it's like, oh, you guys are too busy. We're never too busy to sit down and have this conversation. Now, if everybody said, we want to do it, then we're going to have to schedule some stuff out and figure it out. But we officially want to put out there and say there's an opening. Because the middle part of our mission statement of this church is make disciples. That's not follow me. That's not just be a member of Base Church. That is make disciples that follow Jesus Christ, that hear his words and do them in everyday life. That's what we're shooting for. And so if any of these things are getting in the way, or if any of these areas could use growth to be better at that, then we're saying, and that we're not anybody special, but we're saying we will make time to sit down and specifically work towards growth, because I want to see you glorifying God in a greater way 2 months from now than you are today, a year from now than you are 2 months from now. That's just our heart. That's where we want to be. And you want to share something?
David said most of the things I was going to say, but just to reiterate what he said, like, it is our heart. Like, we say it every single week. Like, we do. We love you guys, each and every one of you. And we hope by now that you know us to be like, we're real to what we say. And so we throw growth out like every single week, because that's what we want to see. So I'm like, what's at the end of the book? Like, I want to know so that then I can move forward. That's just me. So I think sitting here, like, we want you to know that if you want to sit down with us and talk about these things, like, one, it's a commitment. Like, some of these things we want to look at, you want to come have, let's go through finances. We're looking, it's going to be like a couple week commitment, maybe 4 weeks of that. We are committing to that, and we will hold you accountable to that. We're going to work through this together. But also to know, like, you can trust us. David's not going to use you as an example in his sermons. We hope that you know that you guys can come to us, and we're going to, how can we go forward from here? And so also just know that this isn't just like, if you're like, you know what, I want to talk about my marriage. This isn't like, we're in crisis mode, we need help. This is like, I want to just be better, I want to grow. Maybe you are in crisis mode. And being able to say like, hey, we want to get out of this. Like we want to get out of the place that we're at, not our marriage, the place where we're at. Like, let's talk about those things. And so that is our real heart. Like we've had this in our hearts for a while, and now it just seems so fitting of the time to just lay it out. So it starts with like, reach out to us and just say like, I don't really know what I want to talk about, but let's sit down. Like we kind of just laid it out as well, first of all, you have to take the step to reach out to us and just say like, hey, I'd like to sit down with you guys. We probably just share a meal and just talk about where you're at. And then it's like, okay, you know what, maybe it is the finances we want to spend a couple of weeks on. And so it's not anything like complicated or crazy. It's just like, I want to grow. And as we talked about, David said one part of our mission statement, but the other part is to see lives transformed. Like, we don't just want to sit in this room for a year after year after year and be the same people that we were a year ago. And so we want to be like better so that, you know, maybe someone else is walking through a similar situation. Like David said, it's not just about me and you at all. Like, we want you guys to be able to like say to someone else, I was there. I walked through that. Let me come alongside you. And that is like, David always had this analogy. I'm not going to have him share it because he'll keep talking, but it's about like how we don't just want to focus on one tree. We want an entire orchard, and not for the namesake of Base Church, but for God to get the glory. And so we want to raise each one of us up so that it can continue. We can continue to plant more seeds and more trees in the lives of people. And so that is our heart. Like, our heart is one, love for Jesus. Second, love for each and every one of you guys. And so it's not some scary thing. We are not scary, I promise. But I just hope that you can just, as you go home today, as you consider these things, like, just, you know, maybe as a woman, you just want to come and you want to be like, hey, I just want to sit with you and I want to ask you some questions. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say I know it all. I don't. But I'm willing to sit by your side and let's walk through it together. So, I think that was kind of it.
Don't want me to keep talking.
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, that's our heart. Heart is discipleship. It always has been. And we throw it out there, but we wanted you to know really officially. And most of these things starts with just reach out, let's have a dinner together or something. You say, I want to grow. And maybe it doesn't even fall into any of these brackets or anything, but these are just ideas. You say, I want to grow. Then let's just sit down and talk about what that looks like in your life so that, again, we've done all these things. Like I have done whole church financial counseling. We've done marriage counseling and married people. Like, we've done all these deal with sin and accountability and ourselves and others. Like, we've done all these things. And it's not to like a pedigree thing, but we have experience in them to a degree. And so we don't have, you know, like specific book or framework we're walking through. We want to sit down with you, see right where you're at, and then we'll figure out a path through your particular situation to get to a place where just God gets more glory. That is the goal. And so we're just saying we are not too busy, and we can start filling some evenings, or, you know, maybe it was a morning, like I'm off Friday, Saturday. If I could meet with the guy in the morning or something that wants to, we can do those things. We just want you to know that it's real, and please take advantage of it if it will end up in a place where God gets more out of it. Because I know we'll both put in the time if God gets more.